All right, so here we go. Mar decides that she wants to become, to some degree, an initiate in Feri. So she talks to Morpheus, who's the charming, charismatic, dynamic crow lady and warrior that she has met. And they get to talking and email corresponding kind of fitfully. It takes a long time for Morpheus to get back to her. Eventually, Morpheus says, I think I know the teacher for you. They've gone back and forth, and Morpheus has decided that's enough. This is said to be pretty common, that you have to kind of have a pretty strong relationship with someone who's in the order who will recommend you to another teacher. Sometimes I guess they could take you as their own teacher. And I feel like Mar was sort of wishing that Morpheus would be her teacher, but Morpheus decided not. And I kind of get that in a lot of ways. In a lot of these sort of spiritual relationships, they don't work as well if you're too intimate with someone already. A teacher needs to have some remove. All right. So Morpheus names this woman Karina. Now, fairies tend to connect sort of groups and teachers in this way, and there'll be lines of teachers with gurus going all the way up, what I call in India a parampara of this, then that, then that. So Karina and Mar begin to communicate. Mar fills out all these personality forms. She feels really weird about it. They write quite a lot. Karina is asking her an awful lot about herself, and Mar's worrying if it's going to be used against her at some point. And eventually they speak on the phone, and she discovers this Karina woman to be a very blunt, embodied woman who complains often about how little she makes teaching magic and how difficult it is. And she talks about her own personal struggles and pretty much says, I'm a teacher. I'm not your guru and I'm not your role model. I'm here to teach you something, which I find really quite compelling. So ultimately, Mar is given instructions for her practices that she watches in videos online, and she begins working at them. And she talks to Karina a little bit on the phone. But what really has to happen is Mar needs to start preparing. So how does Mar prepare? She begins to do preparatory rituals. Here are Victor and Cora Anderson. These are the ones that created the fairy tradition. This is them in their old age. They're very approachable. They taught people in these ways. So eventually Mar makes her way to New England, and she stays at the house of Karina with her family and whatnot. And it seems like it's more of a feeling out social process where Karina's just trying to be sure that this is a student she wants to be connected to. And at the very end, they do some rituals together right before Mar leaves. All right, so cycle 1, the beginning initiation. This is the beginning of real training. And Mar has to be careful what she says because the materials are oath bound. If you learn this stuff, you're not supposed to tell anybody about it. I mean, I question whether she can even say as much as she can, but I'd say in the last 10 to 15 years, the fairy tradition is less heavily oath-bound, and people talk generally about the fairy tradition. Other people say you don't talk about this religion at all to anybody except for other initiates. So Mar begins her process of doing a lot of cleansing and purification rituals, rubbing herself with eggs. Some of you have mentioned that they've seen that in other religious traditions, bathing in salt and beer and types of things like this. She also begins basic practices in meditation and manipulation of energy. Notice everyone's always manipulating energy. She learns to balance the kala. The kala is said to be light, to be pure, to be forgiven energy, to be pure energy. She connects to a star goddess, and she starts to learn to isolate troubling energies in herself and blast them into elements like water to get rid of them. In time, she'll be trained in astral travel, which is the ability to travel in a sort of body of light in the astral world, which is defined in a number of ways. Astral from astra means star. The astral plane and astral traveling can be traveling through a sort of spiritual version of this world, or it can be thought of as traveling into other worlds through your astral body. There's a lot of training in this in the AA, and a little bit of it just hanging around in the OTO. But if you're hanging around in New Age magical world circles, you're going to hear people talking about astral travel. The big question for me is always, or are you just dreaming? Now, I spent years doing shamanic meditation, which is really, really similar to astral travel. And it's more than a dream. It's less than really traveling physically. I think that's all I can really say about it. It's hard to describe. I go back and forth. Sometimes I think it's a whole bunch of baloney. Other times I think, yeah, there's something to it. I'm pretty ambivalent about astral travel and what the astral body is. There are some very profound connections to the astral body and astral travel within Indic religious traditions and modernity and pre-modernity, and we're just now starting to understand that. I personally wonder if perhaps all of this astral business might have been taught to some nameless occultists at some point in India, and then it filtered into the West being practiced without its Indic context. But it's me. I think everything goes back to India. All right, the fairies look at human beings as having three souls. The fetch, which is the animal soul, the primal form, the desire is kind of like the id, the ego, and the superego in Freudian psychology. The id is the desire and drives. The ego is that mediating conscious self. The superego in Freud is this hectoring ideal of yourself, and the id and the superego are constantly fighting, and the ego is stuck in between. Here you have the fetch, which is like your animal primal self. Does connect to like sort of animal spirits and representations. Then you have another self, which is the talker, like the voice in your head, the one who talks, your ego self, your standard self, your conscious self, and the God form or the God self, sort of the divine version of yourself. A triune notion of self, lower, middle, high, is common throughout these religious traditions. It is important to note that all of this fairy lore is really secret. You can't just go out and read it in a book. There are some books on fairy witchcraft now, but you have to really learn it from another fairy. And my friends that in California encountered them always found them really kind of hostile and intense and haughty and aloof, but to really have something. These days, you can learn more general stuff about fairies, but if you really want to learn any practices, you have to learn it from another person, and that other person is in a lineage that goes all the way back to Victor and Cora Anderson. All right, take a break.